Welcome to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. I'm Ken Hicks. Over the last several weeks, we've been looking at two of the major ideological kind of positions that kind of dominate political discourse. We talked about liberalism and how liberalism focuses on the idea of individual rights and personal autonomy. We have subsequently spent some time talking about conservatism, which is, again, a broad array of ideological perspectives organized around the idea that traditions and mores and myths are also fully important parts of how our politics works, and that when we abandon these things, we do so at our peril. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to explore another Enlightenment ideology that also has some roots in the ancient world, and that is the issue of socialism. And again, that reflects a much more aggressive, what I would call perfectionist approach to understanding society. It's a belief that individuals, that human beings can be can reach their self-realization and actualization in this world. We're going to start with a brief introduction to what kind of socialism really refers to. Secondly, we'll look at how socialists perceive human nature and freedom. And then we're going to talk about the precursors for socialism, some kind of medieval, some ancient. And then, of course, we're going to begin our discussion of Karl Marx. If you look at the slide here, pictured on this slide is sort of an imagined portrait of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, the brothers of a Roman aristocratic family who basically the family's approach to politics in the late Roman Republican period was to argue that the Roman kind of underclass deserved a greater opportunity, and they called for a survey of all the land in Italy and for redistributing that land to poor Romans. They were successively assassinated by their opponents. Their land redistribution program, which was known as Lex Sempronia Agraria, again, was intended to redistribute land to the common people. Some people kind of view what they were arguing as a precursor to modern-day socialism. It's also reflective, again, of the fact that in both of these guys being assassinated by their rivals, and in fact, what ultimately happened with the second one that was killed, Gaius Gracchus, in 121, the people who killed him and his followers were ultimately not prosecuted on the grounds that what they did was for the good of the community, which really accelerated the tendency to civil violence in Roman Republican, those tertiary years of the Roman Republic. So let's talk a little bit about socialism. Like conservatism, socialism has both ancient and modern roots. It has kind of parallel origins to socialism, with classical conservatism, in that they both emerge sort of as a response to the emergence of liberalism and capitalism as sort of dominant ways of looking at the world. You have, again, socialism emerges as a critique of liberalism in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Socialism has some diametrically opposed rationales. While traditional conservatism posited humanity's fallen nature and original sin, socialism imagines human nature as innately sociable and cooperative. While conservatives place enormous significance on customs and moral traditions, socialists assign little to no value to prior comprehensive doctrines and traditions. While conservatives view attempts to redistribute wealth as ineffective or counterproductive, socialists are passionate supporters of leveling. And so these are really ideologies in conservatism and socialism that are emerging on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, with liberalism as their joined, target. And so where conservatism is approaching liberalism from the right and saying that liberalism gives up too much in the way of social traditions and things like that, socialists argue that liberals are just another manifestation of a status quo that is fundamentally unjust. And we have to be clear. Socialism is approaching things from a moral premise. And regardless of what you'll read from socialism, and especially Karl Marx and people who followed him, they would basically say morality has nothing to do with our analysis. But the reality is that there is a moral argument embedded, and that is the moral argument that inequality is innately unjust. So there are two questions that surround socialism. Again, society, otherwise known as government, should own and control property for the benefit of all. How much property and what kind of society is involved in this ownership and control? Socialists have responded to this question in different ways and at different times. Some suggest that all valuable goods should be regarded as public property, while others maintain that only the major, what they call means of production, rivers, forests, large factories, and mines should be publicly owned and controlled. The second question is, how is society to exercise this control? Socialists have generally argued for highly centralized or highly decentralized controls over public property. Socialists are united in their opposition to unrestricted capitalism, which they reject as arbitrary, capricious, and an outmoded approach to economic production and distribution. And again, there is somewhat of a schizophrenic nature within socialism. On the one hand, you have a large number of socialists who are what we would have to describe as revolutionary socialists. They want to overthrow capitalism. They want to overthrow the governments that are supportive of capitalism, and they want to institute governments that will distribute goods and services in an equitable manner. On the other hand, you have socialists who are effectively anarchists, and this kind of will recall the kind of arguments that you see out of extreme libertarians, libertarian anarchists like Murray Rothbard. Again, the ideological continuum kind of bends backward in upon itself. And so for those socialists, people like Charles Fourier and Pierre Proudhon, these folks would argue that we can't have any kind of government because any kind of government will be necessarily coercive. Where all forms of anarchism fail, though, is in recognizing that coercion will exist and people will use coercion. And the question is, how will government actually employ coercion? In terms of human nature and freedom, socialists view freedom primarily through an economic lens, viewing individual freedom as incidental to the access to the material conditions necessary to lead a meaningful life. It should be no surprise that within the United States, within America's political tradition, socialism has generally not been a particularly attractive ideological position. Most Americans, again, there have been socialists who were American. There were a lot of kind of imports at various points in time. But there is this criticism that socialism is contrary to human nature and opposed to freedom. There is also this belief that self-interest must be subsumed to some notion of the greater good. And likewise, the need for aggressive government intervention to suppress egoistic behavior necessarily crushes individual freedom. The picture on this slide is of Ayn Rand, who was born in 1905 within this, what was then Russia, lived within the Soviet Union. She escaped the Soviet Union in the late 40s, I believe, and came to the United States. She appeared as a friendly witness before the House of Representatives Committee on Un-American Activities in 1946 on a wartime movie that was called Song of Russia, which she criticized for its rosy portrayal of life in the Soviet Union. The Republican-controlled House Committee on Un-American Activities criticized the movie, among others, as pro-Soviet propaganda, which, if you know when the movie was shot in 1944, it was pro-Soviet propaganda because during World War II, the Soviet Union was an ally. And so the culture at the time was dedicated towards a more benign depiction of the Soviet Union at that time. The socialists' reply to these kinds of criticism is that humans only appear competitive and selfish because capitalism deranges human nature. Capitalism suppresses natural human impulses for caring and cooperation. For socialists, capitalist freedom is really not worth pursuing. And so socialists innately view freedom in relational terms. And that means for socialists, human beings exist as members of classes engaged in the relations of production, distribution, and exchange of goods and services. Human beings are not isolated bearers of rights as liberals would have it, but are members of a class. For socialists, members of the working class are an oppressed majority whose labor is exploited by the ruling class, i.e., the bourgeoisie. And so when you look at the socialist view of freedom, they're viewing things, their agent for them is the working class. Obstacles are class divisions, inequality, and above all, false consciousness, which we'll explore in greater detail in a few minutes. And the goal is the fulfillment of human needs, which necessarily for socialists involves the establishment of a classless society. And so for socialists, they are looking to establish, to create a world beyond necessity, where the productivity of capitalism is exploited, but without the necessarily seeking of profit. This is one of the arguments that Karl Marx would make that we'll explore in greater detail. The idea of transitioning from a capitalist society to a socialist society is that you would keep the productivity of capitalism, but it would be designed to produce all that is needed for everyone equally. And so for a socialist, either all are free or none are free. And again, if you look at the manifesto of the Communist Party, again, in a socialist society, it calls for the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And again, this is the argument that we don't leave the least of us behind. We don't simply dismiss people. A socialist would view a libertarian like William Graham Sumner's argument that a drunkard in the gutter is precisely where he would be with contempt. They would basically argue that that drunkard in the gutter is probably where he is because of the forces that have put him there. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the precursors. Karl Marx's interpretation of socialism would be considered the dominant view of socialism, certainly from the late 19th well into the 21st century. But socialist ideas predated Marx and has both ancient and Enlightenment roots. When you think about the Platonic dialogues, a lot of people look to the Republic. And the central question there, what is the meaning of justice? Is the just man happier than the unjust man? What constitutes a just community? Plato's just community, according to Plato, within the Socratic dialogues, the argument would be that the just community would be governed by guardians who were denied access both to private property and to wealth. They wouldn't be able to have families as guardians. Reflected Plato's conviction that guardians could be, needed to be educated to norms valuing the greater good of the polis, of the city-state, over that of their personal advantage. And so Plato also argued that such a virtuous community would by necessity be a modest one, where conspicuous wealth would undermine the well-being of the community. Education and art would be dedicated to reinforcing those norms of modesty and the care for the common good. A great deal of scholarship has been devoted to the idea that Plato's description of the perfectly just community was in fact ironic, and that he was really describing the impossibility of such a quest for a perfectly just community. This is certainly the argument of a group of political theorists that are called Straussians. They're organized around the work of a political theorist by the name of Leo Strauss. And that is the argument, that basically, Plato's argument in the Republic is that a perfectly just world cannot be achieved with human beings involved. Early Christian communities also engaged in communal practices that some have characterized as socialist. Early Christians believed that all good Christians had a duty to share their labor and worldly goods with one another. People often forget that prior to 313 AD, Christianity was viewed with suspicion by the Roman political authorities as a Jewish sect, and were frequently subject to persecution, I should say. For that reason, early Christians often adopted a quietistic approach to politics, following Jesus' exhortation to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Early Christians also banned usury, and took seriously the exhortation to care for the least of us. Of course, usury refers to money lending, often at extortionate interest rates. Early Christianity inveighed against all money lending due to the interpretation of Jesus' scripture, especially his cleansing of the temple. Early Christians were not socialists, but certainly their communal practices influenced later political thought. There was a group of early Christians or medieval Christians that you would have to kind of characterize as utopians. St. Thomas More, who was an English lawyer, judge, and statesman and theologian, who was opposed to the Protestant Reformation and wrote a number of polemics against Martin Luther and other contemporary Protestant figures. He refused to accept King Henry as the head of the Anglican Church when Henry led the church out of the Catholic faith, and he was accused and condemned for treason and beheaded. The Catholic Church canonized him in 1935. And again, much of his writing revolved around the idea that money is the root of all evil. He wrote a book that was entitled Utopia. He wrote Utopia in 1516. It was written as a narrative from the perspective of a fictional character, Raphael Hythloday, an old sunburned Portuguese sailor who claimed to have joined Amerigo Vespucci on his exploration on behalf of Spain and Portugal. In his recounting of his voyages, he contrasts the evils of European society with the seemingly virtuous island commonwealth of Utopia, which had banned private property and abolished money as a unit of exchange. More had a lot of titles for this book, but he settled on the Greek utopia, which alternatively has dual meanings, good place and no place. So money is the root of all evil, and when the sailor says there can be no justice where men have private property. And his argument is that men and private property directly lead to inequality and wretchedness. And he again cites Plato, and Plato's claim that the equality of all goods is the best way to have a perfectly just society. Hythloday argues that helping one harms another. It's an inversion of the liberal argument for private property. The rich are covetous, crafty, and really quite useless. The poor, on the other hand, are lowly, simple, and by their daily labor more beneficial to the common welfare than themselves. The proliferation of laws needed to protect private property are themselves evidence of the injustice of private property, according to Hythloday. And he talks about his experiences visiting this island nation, the wise and godly utopians. Money often serves, again, wanton luxury and false pleasure. When people concentrate on useful occupations, every necessity can easily be met. He speaks of, in Utopia, there are various groups of people who serve the state. And the Syphogrants act as virtuous leaders. And he talks about how all utopian cities are divided into groups of roughly 30 households, each of which elects their own Syphogrant to lead them. Scholars are exempted from labor and devote themselves to learning, and from the universe of scholars, other government officials, including ambassadors, priests, and tranibors, who are elected officials who represent 10 Syphogrants and the 300 households that each Syphogrant represents. It's a very sort of informal way of looking at things, and it kind of reflects the way church hierarchy worked in More's time. So in Utopia, there is no such thing as keeping up with the Joneses. Utopians are not constantly employed in building or repairing houses, because there is no one who wants to build a larger castle that could then be, become an object of envy of other people. Utopians collectively maintain homes and proactively identify repairs. Utopians' homes last a very long time with very little labor, because they don't adorn their homes with, carvings and things like that. Things that are effectively, according to More, objects of personal vanity. Utopians are not impressed by fancy clothing. There's no stigma attached to wearing the same clothes many days in a row, unless, of course, they become unhygienic. Linen is preferred because it's more versatile, but they only wear white. They don't feel a need to, adorn themselves with bright colors. Cleanliness matters more to a utopian than the fineness of the thread. Utopians have uses. They deliberately put gold and silver to particularly odious use. Utopians value iron far more than otherwise precious metal, because iron has a greater value. While they eat and drink from plain earthen or glass vessels, they fashion chamber pots out of gold and silver. Utopians use precious metals as marks of reproach and infamy. Those few utopians who commit crimes are compelled to wear gold rings on their fingers and wear gold chains around their necks and gold crowns upon their heads as symbols of their sin. Likewise, pearls and diamonds, they don't look for them, but when they find them, they polish them up and give them to their children. The children are initially proud of their adornments, but eventually they see them as childish trifles without being told to. Utopian children cast these baubles aside when they grow older and ascend to adulthood. Hythloday speaks of the visit of another group of people, the Animolians, who had not visited Utopia and didn't know their ways. And they came to the Utopian capital adorned in silks and gold, whereupon a Utopian child exclaimed to her mother, "Look, mother, at that big ninny who still wears pearls and jewels like a little child." When the ambassadors saw how little Utopians valued rich clothing, they put away their fancy clothes. And again, this is supposed to be sort of a homily of saying that modesty leads to a more just society. He speaks about Utopia as a just commonwealth. Among utopians where nothing is private, the common affairs are their real concerns. They don't have to worry about their livelihood and prosperity. Among Europeans, I can find no evidence of justice, declares Hythloday. Is it justice when a rich goldsmith or moneylender has a pleasant and prosperous life, while poor laborers, carters, ironsmiths, carpenters, and plowmen, by great and continual toil, are barely able to stay alive? You see again the moral implications here. There is a moral argument that is being made on the part of More, who was again a medieval Christian, a medieval Catholic, if you will, inveighing against the sin of wealth. He argues that it is a conspiracy of wealth. He accuses the wealthy of serving their own interests under the name of the common good. These devices, which the rich declare, must be kept and observed for the sake of the common good, and so they are made laws. And they're also made mores and traditions. In utopia where the desire for money is banished, how great a heap of cares is cut away. And so, again, this is an example of a medieval Christian who is effectively saying that, as much as we value money, it has a perverse value, that it actually undermines the common good. The more we rely on money for things, the more we undermine any concept of the common good. So one of the important things when you look at precursors to socialism, you have to understand the effects of the Industrial Revolution on European society and then ultimately on American society. It was an enormously disruptive consequence that the Industrial Revolution really tore up, the basic fabric of English society. You also have to look and understand the effects of the English Civil War in encouraging religious utopian thought. You had a group called the Diggers, who were a religious sect that split away from the Levelers, who were themselves a political movement during the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651. They claimed that God created the earth for all people to share in equally and called for the abolition of private property. Because the Diggers didn't have a clear understanding of which land they could share, and they quickly ran into legal troubles, and subsequent prosecutions compelled them to disband. You also have, again, the enclosure movement, which if you don't know from history what the enclosure movement is, this is a period where the English landholders, mostly the nobility, began enclosing what were known as common lands. These were lands around villages where people could graze cattle and get a little bit ahead. And the English, the nobility, wanted to enclose that land to grow sheep on, because sheep could be sheared. Shearing created large amounts of wool. Wool would go to the factories, and the factories would use that wool to create clothing. And so, again, prior to the enclosure movement, most people wore homespun thread in England. But the Industrial Revolution, one of the main engines of that revolution was the creation of these huge factories for making woolen clothing. And so you had enormous social dislocations of people moving from the city, or moving from rural areas into the city to find work, because they no longer were able to work in agriculture, because agriculture had been made to be more efficient and more effective through farming techniques. And so you had the emergence of kind of sudden people moving into urban life. And then suddenly they found themselves dependent on a wage to sustain themselves, which was oftentimes a very perilous way of living. And no one makes any excuses about the early part of the Industrial Revolution. It was horrible to work in those factories. People were driven to death. People were impoverished even though they were working. Part of the power of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is in kind of portraying just how pitiless those factory owners were, people like Ebenezer Scrooge. Those kinds of critiques provoked reform movements, largely led by liberals. More radical critics of capitalism called for the entire system's abolition. For the most part, the advocates of the abolition of capitalism were socialists. And their rationales revolved around two basic premises. Again, the moral outrage at such an exploitative system of labor and exchange. And second, the appeal to science and history, and the belief that historical forces were at play that would undermine capitalism and pave the way to a more equitable socialist future. One of the more important precursors to Marx as a socialist was a French aristocrat by the name of Claude Henry de Saint-Simon. He lived from 1716 to 1825, and he actually traveled to America as a very young man. He was part of Lafayette's retinue. He was present at the siege of Yorktown. He was widely viewed as a person who could see future trends very clearly, while also being quite mad. There's a misspelling on my slide that I just spotted. The key contribution that Saint-Simon made to socialist thought was this idea that history was divided into successive stages or periods. This would be something that would also influence Hegel. Saint-Simon would posit that feudalism was characterized as an alliance between the landed nobility and a clergy that provided a religious foundation for a system of ascribed status. This historical epoch was undermined and finally dislodged by the Enlightenment and the emergence of industrial society. And so Saint-Simon also contributed this idea of industrialism to socialist thought. And he rejected the idea of individuals as a mere abstraction. He called for a centrally planned economy led by experts to meet social needs. He and his disciple, Auguste Comte, called for a scientifically planned society that was legitimized by a humanist religion. Comte's ideas about scientific industrialism, I think, reflect to some extent the arguments of the technocrats that we talked about in our previous lecture. It was a decidedly non-democratic vision of the future. Again, people in the 19th century oftentimes had little faith that the average person could be could be trusted with a vote, for example. A lot of these folks believed that most people lacked the intellect because they were uneducated. They were constantly employed in work just in order to make ends meet. Another important kind of precursor to Marxism is Charles Fourier. Fourier lived from 1772 to 1837. He was one of the originators of what today we call intentional communities or communes. It was powerfully influential in Southern Europe, in the countries of Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece. He was an influential voice for what we might call utopian socialism. He drew on a mix of mysticism, numerology, and early iterations of psychological theory to devise his ideas regarding, kind of socialist communities. He denounced civilization as debased and was infecting its inhabitants with false beliefs. And chief among those false beliefs were that money could buy happiness. He speaks of the 12 passions, Fourier did. He listed the 12 passions, including the 5 senses of sight, vision, smell, hearing, and taste. To these, he added the butterfly passion for variety, the Kabbalistic passion for plotting and intrigue, the composite passion for combining physical and mental pleasure. He also identified a 13th passion for harmony, which comes when the 12 basic passions are brought into proper alignment. That gets you back to this idea of a kind of psychological theory before psychology had fully been developed as a discipline. So the highest stage of human development for Fourier was harmonism, where all these different passions were synthesized. How you go about achieving this harmonization is, again, another question. And you've seen, if you've studied communes and intentional communities, there is always this kind of aspect of meditation. We're going to sit down and think about things, and that's really where a lot of this stuff, it's. And I joke a lot in my political theory classes. The 19th century philosophy is really interesting, and it's fascinating because they got to this point where they were always thinking about some end point and they didn't know how to get there. And so I call it the yada yada effect, drawing on an episode of Seinfeld. It's like you don't like, if you're a reactionary, you don't like, the end of feudalism, yada yada. We get back to, feudalism. For Marxism, it was we don't like class conflict, yada yada. Communism. Marx, more than most 19th century theorists, did attempt to kind of draw out what he thought was going to happen. But again, he did it in such a way that really exposed him to arguments that he wasn't being as scientific as he thought. And so again, like most socialists, Fourier believed that people would cooperate freely toward a common good if they were simply properly directed. And he wanted the world to be decentralized. He didn't want there to be any kind of central government. And his advocacy was for phalanstery, these were utopian communities numbering about 1,600 in inhabitants, and you would have the principle of attractive labor, which posits that people will voluntarily work only if they find occupations that engage their talents. And so there would be something going on within these communities that would enable people to be directed in the direction that they want to go, and that everyone would find a proper blend of different occupations, and that somehow it would all work out. And on this slide again is this is what he imagined one of his intentional communities would look like. Another very important utopian, a precursor again of Marx, although again to some extent they were a bit contemporaries. Marx was born in 1818, Owen was born in 1771. He lived to 1858, so they overlap a bit. He was a Welsh manufacturer and social reformer. He did most of his experimenting on utopian communities in Scotland. He argued basically for the inversion of original sin. He followed the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He found sin not in the individual character defects, but rather he saw character defects as resulting from a deformed social system. He was particularly invested in Rousseau's writings on education. Owen believed that deformed character was the byproduct of deformed education. And what needed to happen was the establishment of these places where people could be educated in the proper way. And he established a model textile factory in New Lanark, Scotland, based on progressive working standards. And it was, the factory was routinely cleaned. Working conditions were safe based on the standards of the day. The work week was reduced. Children younger than 10 were not allowed to work, but instead were educated at the factory owner's, in other words, Robert Owen's, expense. So let's look at his address to the inhabitants of New Lanark as, again, an example of this utopian aspect of socialist thought that emerged in the middle of the 19th century. Owen notes that the present belief system basically argues that each individual forms his or her own character, that the affections are at the command of the individual, and that a large portion of humanity must exist in ignorance and poverty to secure the happiness of a small minority. Owen argues that facts prove otherwise, and he comes up with these 8 basic arguments: that character is formed for and not by the individual. In other words, there are external factors at play. Secondly, any habits and sentiments may be given to humanity. In other words, that if you give people the right kind of sentiments, if you form them the right way, they will, kind of recognize a higher purpose. 3, the affections are not under the control of the individual. 4, every individual can be trained to produce for more than he can consume. 5, nature has provided the means to give the greatest happiness to every individual. 6, a community can be organized to eliminate vice and facilitate enduring happiness. 7, society hitherto has been founded on erroneous principles. And 8, the abandonment of the old erroneous system and the adoption of the new system can be achieved without the slightest injury to any human being. Now that last one is very important because he's not talking about revolution. As an Englishman, as a Welshman or whatever you want to call him, there is this innate distaste for revolution, much like there is here in the United States as well. And so he is an advocate for gradualism, that sudden change would necessarily involve injurious coercion. Change requires the preparation of resistant minds. This is a very important quote. They must first be convinced of their blindness. This cannot be effected even among the least unreasonable or those termed the best part of mankind in their present state without creating some degree of irritation. And that irritation must be avoided. For Owen, to use Owen's argument, it must be tranquilized before you can proceed to the next steps. He claims his new system is a new system, but not new ideas. These are not newfangled ideas. They have never been combined as he devised. Only by bringing these ideas into practice together can they be rendered beneficial to humanity. This new system will not be like any past revolutions. He argues that within his system, genuine charity and kindness will come to the fore. Men shall not be called upon to assent to doctrines and to dogmas which do not carry conviction to their minds. They shall not be told that they must love that which they are compelled to dislike. The new system shall make its way into the heart of every person because its practice will be so distinct from the present misery. Now, again, what he's basically just talking about is a beneficent, godly, caring kind of community founded by him. He had the money to do it. He was a wealthy industrialist. In fact, his experiment in New Lanark, Scotland, worked quite well. He then attempted to transplant his idea of an ideal community, and he set up a community, the name escapes me, in Indiana, in the United States. He set it up, he invested in it, and it collapsed within the span of a few months. And the problem, and it's the problem that you see a lot with communes, is that there are some people who just don't buy in. If you don't get people to buy in, you get a lot of free riding. And free riding is the death of any kind of intentional community. In fact, it can lead to hard feelings just among roommates. So we're going to go back to the precursors. And again, although Karl Marx is a dominant figure in socialist intellectual thought, there were a couple that were rivals and that really remained sort of challengers for the dominant kind of interpretation of socialism. And another one of the guys that was sort of a contemporary of Karl Marx is Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon was famous for his declaration, "Private property is theft." In 1840, he wrote a book, "What is Property?" that attracted the attention of a young Karl Marx. Proudhon came from a relatively modest background and at a relatively young age entered into the printing business. He actually taught himself Latin to improve his ability to edit ecclesiastical text. The two began, and again, in 1840, Marx was in his probably late 20s. He probably finished, I believe, his doctoral studies. And they corresponded, and they briefly struck up a friendship while Marx was living in exile in Paris. If you remember, he lived there from, I believe, 1842 until 1846 or so. They had a falling out because of Marx's publication of The Poverty of Philosophy, which was an extended and fairly bitter critique of Proudhon's arguments in What is Property. And so Proudhon's contribution to socialist thought was the idea of mutualism, which called for, again, the formation of decentralized political federations. From an ideological standpoint, again, Proudhon was difficult to pigeonhole. Some consider him to be more of a European exemplar of individualist anarchism, while others, again, note his influence in France, Spain, and Italy over the socialist parties in those countries. Marx was a consistent and acerbic critic of Proudhon's work wherever he encountered it, dismissing it as counter-revolutionary and as a distraction of the proletariat from developing revolutionary class consciousness. In a later presentation, I'll note that Marx was engaged in his later years with various factions of the French socialists. And the French socialists that were describing themselves as Marxists were advancing kind of a synthetic blend of Marxist thought with Proudhonism. And Marx was so distraught at that kind of combination that he wrote to his son-in-law, Par Lefagor, and he basically said, one thing is certain, and that it is that I am not a Marxist, if that's what Marxism is. So now let's begin our discussion of Karl Marx, the formation of his philosophical, economic, and ideological thought. When you look at someone like Karl Marx, it's really a tale of two thinkers. On the one hand, it's easy to dismiss Marx and Marxism as simply a mistake when you look at the failures of Marxist-Leninist thinking in the 20th century. But there's really two Marxes, and one is Marx, the political activist and revolutionary theorist, and the other is Marx, the sociologist and economist. And he really studied deeply, the classical economists in the years of his exile, especially in Paris. As a young man, Karl Marx was born into a Jewish family in Trier. He had rabbis on both sides of his family. The status of European Jews in the post-Napoleonic era, and remember, Marx was born in 1818. The Napoleonic Wars had ended around 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, which effectively ended Napoleon's control over France. And so European Jews had been denied citizenship throughout Europe well into the 17th century. And during that Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment, certain countries emancipated their Jewish populations, giving them access to citizenship, education, and official positions in government. Those countries where the Enlightenment did not have as deep a hold, especially in the German principalities and Prussia, that really didn't happen. When you had the French Revolution, the French revolutionaries emancipated their Jewish population in 1791. And Napoleon extended Jewish emancipation in all the territories under French control. However, following the defeat of Napoleon, several countries reverted to systematic discrimination and denial of citizenship. And Karl Marx's family, again, as I said, had rabbis on both sides of his family, and his father had earned a secular education and had found work within the Prussian government as a lawyer. But he was stripped of his positions following Napoleon's defeat. So as a result, Karl Marx's father renounced his Jewish faith in 1817 or 1818, which again was the year Marx was born, and became a Lutheran and was able subsequently to find work as a lawyer. Marx attended initially university at the University of Bonn. He was an enthusiastic joiner of the fraternities and developed a reputation as a lover of beer. His activities there led his parents to compel his transfer to the University of Berlin, which was a much more demanding university at the time, much more prestigious. And it was there that Marx began his early association with a group known as the Young Hegelians. I'm going to take a drink here because my voice is getting hard. The Young Hegelians were a group of German intellectuals who drew radical implications from the works of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was an early 19th century philosopher. He lived from 1717 to 1831. He was a dominant figure in continental philosophy in the early 19th century. He was a decidedly kind of anti-Enlightenment philosopher. We will address his influence over Marx in our next presentation. But for now, it's important to recognize that that factions formed around Hegel's philosophy. And there were key folks on the right. They became known as right Hegelians, who became important figures in the counter-Enlightenment. And those, they were Europeans who criticized the Enlightenment's emphasis on universal reason and the belief in human progress. Their work tended to be theological, primarily in nature. And on the other hand, you had left Hegelians who drew from Hegelianism the conviction that the purpose of philosophy and history was to remove restraints on reason and freedom. Marx's commitment to Hegel's philosophical framework from a kind of left perspective was one of the most consistent aspects of Marxian, which refers to the economic, philosophical, and ideological work directly related to Marx or to his collaborator, Friedrich Engels. And so some of the more prominent young Hegelians were people like Bruno Bauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, Arnold Ruge, Max Stirner, and David Strauss, all of whom at various times Marx would criticize for their theological emphasis. Marx's most, and what he was basically saying was they're focusing too much on a critique of Christianity, and they need to focus their criticisms more accurately towards what he considered to be the gravamen of the problem, which was, capitalism. And so his most comprehensive statement on the young Hegelians can be found in the German Ideology, where we see Marx's use of ideology as that was discussed in our earlier presentation on the evolution of ideology as a concept. So we're going to continue our discussion of Marx, and we're going to start talking about his influence, or the influence he had, or the influence that Hegel exerted over Marx. And so, again, Marx, Hegelianism was prevalent in German philosophical thought in the early and mid 19th century. And Hegel was what we would describe as an idealist. He argued that human history moves in a discernible direction, that humanity can't get outside itself to see beyond the confines of whatever language we're using to describe things. Hegel spoke a great deal about Geist, or the unfolding evolution of human spirit. Spirit he identified as potential waiting to be actualized. Freedom was the most important of those aspects of Geist for Hegel. And so for Hegel, he spoke a lot about this idea of alienation. And he basically said that human beings go through, humanity is going through a process very similar to the growth cycle of a human being, from birth to childhood to adulthood. And so alienation refers to the idea of the estrangement of persons or classes of people from their human potential. And you have this transition from infancy to child. That's the first of several separations in the process of actualizing a person as a distinct human being. Remember, when you're born, you don't have language, you don't really have the capacity to care for yourself. Your first potty training marks an enormous transition for children towards, freeing themselves from having to be constantly cared for by their parents or their caregivers. When you first begin to walk, the first steps are an enormously important thing. Now you can move around. That's always when parents get terrified. Again, when you become a teenager, when you go away to college, these are points at which, for Hegel, humanity is going through similar kinds of distinct stages. Another important aspect of Hegel's thought is this idea of the cunning of reason. And that, this is, again, the process by which intentional actions produce unintended but nevertheless rational and spirit-promoting, otherwise freedom-promoting consequences. And Hegel worked within the framework of what he called a dialectic, which is a process whereby opposite views or forces come into conflict, which eventually leads to the reconciliation of opposition into a new and presumably higher form of relationship. So the dialectic of reason gradually increases and creates more and more inclusive ideas of freedom. And old institutions and customs can no longer contain the human yearning for freedom. This kind of complex dialectic, the cunning of reason, it's all captured within a parable that Hegel offers. It's called the master and slave dialectic, and this is from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807. And again, he's talking about two diametrically opposed realities, the master and the slave. Initially, each consciousness sees the other as an existential threat and engages in a mortal struggle, which culminates in the master compelling the slave to submit to his will. Both are motivated primarily by fear of the other, but both consciousnesses need the other. The master must be acknowledged by the slave as master, while the slave must be reduced to the status of chattel or mere tool to be used by the master. If you remember the TV show Roots, where Kunta Kinte is whipped because he refuses to use his slave name of Toby, and he's whipped and said, "What is your name?" And he keeps saying, "My name is," until he's eventually broken. So the slave begins the process of the dialectic, and it's the slave's journey to freedom that interests both Hegel and ultimately Marx. At first, the slave's fear of death challenges his or her existence, and they work for the master out of fear of imminent death. Over time, the slave's labor brings them into close connection with nature, and through their labor, they see their potential independence in the objects of their labor, of what they produce. Meanwhile, the master is in a state of incompleteness. The master receives recognition from the slave, but it's a recognition the master doesn't appreciate because the slave lacks dignity and equality. Why do you care what the slave thinks about you? He's inferior. The master's identity remains dependent on his or her ownership of the slave or their slaves, because they do no labor themselves. they don't transform themselves through any engagement with the world, other than through what they do with their leisure time. And so ultimately, what, in Hegel's telling, the master and the slave dialectic is a demonstration of the unsustainability of such a one-sided relationship. The master appears to hold all the cards. He holds the keys to the chains, the whips, and all the instruments of pain that facilitate enslavement. At the same time, their consciousness as a master is stunted. Once the slave loses his fear of imminent death, and the master realizes he or she is morally stunted and cut off from history, both the master and slave are stripped of their historic particularity, and they confront at last their common humanity as free and equal human beings. They ultimately lose their fear of one another. And so Hegel tells this parable of the master and the slave as an illustration of how the dialectical process works. And Marx would employ the dialectic in similarly emancipatory ways to spin out a narrative for arguing for the abolition of capitalism. So Marx has a kind of theory of history, right? And again, it's something that Hegel borrowed from Saint-Simon, and Marx borrows from Hegel. And that again is reflects this conflict between the right and left Hegelians that takes place primarily on a theological plane, and where primarily fights over the emancipatory implications of Hegel's idealism. And now remember, Marx begins as a left Hegelian, but he quickly becomes dissatisfied with the confinements of theological theory. So Marx ultimately turns Hegel on his head and offers a materialist conception of history, which I'll discuss in a little bit more. And one of the famous quotes here is him basically saying the history of hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. The material forces of production refer to how human labor transforms raw materials into goods. And so before men do anything else, they must first produce the means of their subsistence. And so let's talk for a minute about the materialist conception of history. He's recounting, early in this writing, his experiences in 1842 and 1843 with what he described as the amateur materialism as the editor of Rheinische Zeitung, which was the Rhineland Times, which was a radical German language newspaper published in Cologne, which is a large city now in eastern Germany, but which in Marx's time was part of Prussia, I believe. It was a city dominated by Catholics in a Protestant-dominated state. And so Cologne was a hotbed for radical thought prior to the formation of the German state in 1871, and thereafter became a focal point of what became known as the Kulturkampf, which was a cultural struggle between Germany and the Catholic Church over controls of central aspects of German culture. And so in attempting on Marx's part to understand these French tendencies, he said, I have to go back to Hegel. And the general result was him, what he described as turning Hegel on his head. And that is, Marx's conviction that idealism is fundamentally flawed, and that in fact states and all legal relations have their origins in the material conditions of life. And so the real foundation of society, the sum total of the relations of production, constitute the social, the economic structure of society. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but their social being that determines their consciousness. And the forms of development of the productive forces turn into their fetters. We become the jobs that we do. Just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so too we cannot judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. For Marx, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life and from the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of production. And so he basically is arguing, again, like Hegel, like Saint-Simon, that history produced, just kind of proceeds from one epoch to another based on the materialism, based on what we are doing to produce the goods that we need in order to survive. So social orders do not perish until room has been created for a newer, higher relations of production. Therefore, mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve. In their times, Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production can be designated as progressive epochs in the economic formation of society. Again, what he's saying here is that in each historic period, you have a mode of production. This is how goods are done. In the feudal era, you had the nobility that owned the land, and they used serfs to grow crops, and that was basically, it wasn't much more than subsistence, right? Remember how feudalism originated as the Roman Empire collapsed and as Asian tribes invaded into Europe. The whole point of feudalism was to create strongholds where people could survive. And so that was a very unforgiving mode of existence. And really what was needed was a kind of subsistence economy. But over time, what is beginning to happen? Populations are growing and getting larger. You get through the plagues, which do certain, the Black Plague and other plagues, which thin out a certain number of things in certain ways, but you still have larger populations. And that is creating eventually the guild towns that would spell the death of feudalism, right? The emergence of those guild towns are what lead to the undermining of feudal modes of social arrangement. It's important to keep in mind, though, that feudalism lasted for hundreds of years. Marx is looking at capitalism as a phenomenon that really was at most 100 years old, probably less than that even. And yet he's already saying that it's outmoded, okay? So the bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of social process of production. Now, why is he saying that? Because again, he's convinced, he has the answers, he's a scientific socialist, that this is it. That now we're going to have such a sufficient concentration of classes that when the proletariat take over and win control, the parable of the master and slave coming to realization, they will then have such dominance over the political instrumentation, the ideological superstructure of society, that they will be able to end all this stuff. It's yada yadaism in its fullest form. So Marxist Hegelianism says this social formation brings, therefore, the prehistory of humanity to a close. And again, it's the problem that he has, that he wants to be scientific. At the same time, he wants to be Hegelian. And Hegelian really isn't scientific. Okay? And this is one of the basic contradictions within socialist thought, especially within Marxian thought, that later socialists would find themselves, kind of wrestling over. Okay? So I'm going to close on this note. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of Marxism and the kind of the Marxist theory of socialism. I'll see you next time.